seated. So you might notice that things are not quite like they used to be in the before times, like I like to say. We had to make a pretty quick pivot this week to be ready for in-person worship. So we didn't have time to print our usual bulletins. And so if things feel a little wonky, it's because they are, and we're gradually getting back into our familiar routines and also embracing some new ones. With that said, I'm going to go back to the words for centering and read you this blessing from the poet Jan Richardson. All those days, you felt like dust, like dirt, as if all you had to do was turn your face toward the wind and be scattered to the four corners, or swept away by the smallest breath as insubstantial. Did you not know what the Holy One can do with dust? This is the day we freely say we are scorched. This is the hour we are marked by what has made it through the burning. This is the moment we ask for the blessing that lives within the ancient ashes, that makes its home inside the soil of this sacred earth. So let us be marked not for sorrow, and let us be marked not for shame. Let us be marked not for false humility or for thinking we are less than we are, but for claiming what God can do within the dust, within the dirt, within the stuff of which the world is made, and the stars that blaze in our bones, and the galaxies that spiral inside the smudge we bear. It was a promising start, but ultimately disappointing. These were the words at the top of my final term paper in the fall semester of my senior year as an undergrad at Wake Forest. It was a promising start, but ultimately disappointing. Ouch. I was a good student, accustomed to A's and feedback that didn't generally contain the word disappointing, even where corrections were made. I had never taken a class with Dr. Phyllis Tribble before. Phyllis Tribble, who'll turn 90 this year, if you don't know, is a groundbreaking scholar of the Hebrew Bible, considered one of the foremothers of feminist biblical criticism. Her books, God and the Rhetoric of Sexuality, which we read in my class, and Texts of Terror, changed the course of biblical scholarship. In particular, her interpretation of the creation story of Genesis 2 was revolutionary. She was the first to recognize, at least in a printed publication, that the first human God creates in Genesis 2 is not a man with gender or sexuality, but an earth creature, a Ha-Adam, who, like God, is without sex or gender. Dr. Tribble noticed that sex and gender are introduced into the text only when there are two earth creatures, the Ish and Isha in Hebrew, man and woman, woman and man. But only after the woman or man is fashioned from one side of the earth creature. What's traditionally translated as rib is more literally side of the earth creature. Now you can imagine how provocative this interpretation was about 40 years ago to traditional scholarship and the theology that it had perpetuated. That the male was created first and the female second, and the purpose of the woman was to be a helper and supporter of the male, a subordinate position with no real independent personhood to speak of. All kinds of misogynistic readings of Genesis 2 came out of that traditional translation and interpretation. And Phyllis Tribble's scholarship interrupted that trajectory. As I mentioned, in Genesis 2, the original Hebrew language describes vividly how God reshapes both creatures, both the first human and his companion, as a potter reshapes clay. Dr. Will Gaffney points out that in Genesis 2, verse 7, the verb used there is a verb typically used for crafting pottery. In the creation story, God is making art. And in this foundational story, sex and gender are not fixed, immutable qualities, but attributes that emerge in the context of relationship. As God is working out the kinks of this project called humanity. Ha-Adam, from Ha-Adamah. The human from the humus. The earthling composed of the dark, rich, fertile topsoil of the earth. The one we typically called Adam. This is the dust from which we are made and to which we return. The fertile potting soil of creation. God creates and shapes and calls it good. And then God isn't done yet. He fiddles, she fiddles, they fiddle with it a little more in a dynamic and responsive process with their creation. Creation in the biblical sense is not a one-time historic event. It is an ongoing, organic, and evolutionary process. I think this is the most remarkable aspect of this story to me. Initially, God creates the animals so that the human will not be alone. But Scripture says, even after this, For the human, there was not found one to rely on as its partner. I wonder, how could God tell that the animals alone were not sufficient companions? I know some people feel like their dogs are way better than their human relationships. Was it just that God was paying really close attention? Or was God listening when the earth creature expressed disappointment and asked for something more? Can you imagine the sovereign God, artist at work, soliciting feedback on this new creation? Our Presbyterian friends, just a little down the street, have a saying that they try to live by and often call to mind when they celebrate Reformation Sunday. Reformed, yet always reforming. It's part of their theological framework to keep fiddling with the project of church. And this theological framework has wonderful grounding in the story of creation from Genesis. Drafts, editing, revisions, essential parts of the creative process and the practice of being human. And apparently, they're also part of what it means to be divine. Trying, learning, growing, failing, falling apart, starting over, recreating a life. It's all good and all part of the sacred journey toward wholeness. I recently learned from my therapist about a concept named by the psychologist John Gottman called, quote, willingness to accept influence. Our capacity to practice this willingness to accept influence, it turns out, is perhaps partly a result of our temperament, partly a result of how we're raised in our family of origin, but also has a lot to do with how we are socialized in society and our social location. It turns out, as you might imagine, that individuals who have been born into a social location that gives them more power or status or authority typically develop less capacity for willingness to accept influence. Now, this varies, of course, from individual to individual, but the research shows that this is a capacity women tend to develop more quickly or thoroughly than men by virtue of social location. It's a skill and a capacity, though, that is extremely important, as you can probably also imagine, for all kinds of social relationships. It matters a lot between coworkers. It matters a lot in government and international relations. It matters a whole lot in churches, especially ones that try to make decisions by building consensus. More and more, as we learn about this willingness to accept influence, we realize that it is particularly important for people in positions of authority to develop the capacity to accept influence from those who hold less authority. It's important, for example, for parents to establish structure and discipline in the home, but also to learn from their children and adapt to the needs of each individual child. It's important for a boss to be able to generate feedback and ideas from their subordinate employees. We are very much aware now as a culture that it's important for people who have been socialized as white because of their skin color to accept the influence of people of other races, to educate and show us the way forward in race relations. It's also important for those who've been longtime members of a church or any institution to be able to accept influence from the newer members who bring fresh ideas and perspective. If you want an image of the antithesis of willingness to accept influence, you only have to look in the news from recent days and those pictures of Vladimir Putin sitting at the far end of a banquet table with his so-called advisors at the opposite end. Friends, we are living through an era where there is a lot we don't know. It's the era of not knowing. And most of us have been socialized that not knowing is wrong, that it's weakness. No matter how many degrees or credentials or years of experience one has earned, however, there is so much more to understand and so much yet to discover about our shared future. Not knowing is not the sin. Let me repeat, not knowing is not the sin. The sin is the unwillingness to learn and grow and accept influence. When I got my paper at the end of that fall semester and read those, which at the time were painful words, I felt a sense of embarrassment and shame. I was still too young and sort of unaware to realize the intellectual giant that was Dr. Phyllis Tribble. But I knew she was a person that I really had hoped to impress. At the end of the year, at graduation, when the students in the religion department gathered for a reception, she asked me about my plans for post-graduation. I told her I had been accepted into the Pacific School of Religion, which I didn't end up going to, which is a whole nother story about revisions. But when I told Dr. Tribble, she smiled warmly and she said, "They'll be lucky to have you." There's something comforting about someone who sees you for the fullness of who you are including those unpolished moments not ready for publishing, and still believes the world is lucky to have you. May we all lean heavily on that kind of grace this Lent, and let it propel us forward into a season of growth and new possibilities. May it be so. Amen.